Victory lights burn across London as the war finally ends. Streets that once echoed with sirens now fill with voices. Crowds gather beneath flags still hanging from buildings scarred by fire and smoke. Windows glow again, even where glass was once shattered. The public story is simple and comforting. Britain has survived. Against all odds, it has endured. Speeches promise renewal. Headlines speak of triumph. The war, people are told, has forged unity and secured the future. This is the image that settles into memory. A nation standing tall, undefeated, allied with a powerful friend, ready to rebuild and lead once more. But history often begins to lie the moment celebrations start. Behind the cheers, another reality waits quietly. In rooms far from the crowds, ledgers sit open. Vaults are counted. Contracts are reviewed. The war may be over, but the reckoning has already begun. Britain did not emerge from this conflict as a master of its destiny. It emerged as a debtor. The empire survived the battlefield, yet lost something more dangerous in the process. It lost financial independence, and that loss would shape everything that followed. During the war, Britain fought for survival, not profit. Resources were burned at a pace unseen in earlier conflicts. Factories worked nonstop. Ships crossed oceans under constant threat. Gold reserves thinned. Overseas investments were liquidated to pay for immediate needs. At first, these were framed as sacrifices for victory, temporary measures, necessary pain. But wars fought on borrowed money do not end when the guns fall silent. They end when the bills are paid. And in this case, the bill was larger than anything Britain had ever faced. Another war unfolded alongside the fighting, almost invisible to the public. It took place not on beaches or in skies, but in vaults, offices, and conference rooms. Emergency agreements were signed under pressure. Credit lines were extended with urgency. Supplies arrived not as gifts, but as obligations. Food, fuel, steel machinery. Each shipment carried an invisible price tag attached to the future. Survival funded on credit is not freedom. It is obligation. Think about that. The United States did not conquer Britain with armies. It financed Britain's survival. This distinction matters. Military victory still allows dignity. Financial dependence quietly removes it. Loans come wrapped in reassurance, not threats. They arrive with signatures, not soldiers. But their effect is often more lasting. Once a nation becomes dependent on external finance, its choices narrow. Decisions must be weighed not only against national interests, but against creditor confidence. That shift had already begun before peace was declared. For generations, Britain had been the heart of global finance. Its currency moved trade. Its banks funded development. Its capital shaped continents. Money once flowed outward from London, buying influence and stability across the world. Now, for the first time in modern history, the flow reversed. Britain was no longer exporting capital. It was importing it, and the scale was unprecedented. This was not a short-term bridge loan. It was a structural transformation. In public, the alliance with America was celebrated as a partnership of equals. Two democracies standing shoulder to shoulder against tyranny. The language was warm and reassuring. Allies, friends, shared values. Yet partnerships between nations are never just about values. They are about leverage. And leverage flows toward the side with surplus power. By the end of the war, one country possessed industrial strength, intact infrastructure, and vast financial reserves. The other possessed damage, exhaustion, and debt. Imagine a ship that survives a storm but loses its rudder. It floats. It moves. But it no longer chooses its direction. Britain after the war was that ship, alive, proud, and exposed. The empire still existed on maps. Flags still flew. But beneath the symbols, control was slipping. Not because of defeat, but because of dependency. The danger of debt is not immediate collapse. It is delayed constraint. At first, borrowing feels like relief. It keeps systems running. It prevents chaos. It buys time. During the war, time was everything. Britain needed supplies now, not later. It needed food to feed cities, fuel to move fleets, and steel to build weapons. There was no alternative. Domestic resources could not cover the cost. The empire's traditional financial model was overwhelmed by the scale of total war. Every decision made under those conditions was rational in the moment. Borrow to survive. Borrow to resist. Borrow to win. Few questioned the long-term consequences while bombs were falling. That is how debt gains power. It enters during crisis, when choice is limited and urgency dominates. By the time peace arrives, the structure is already set. As the war dragged on, Britain's financial position worsened quietly. Gold reserves shrank. Overseas assets were sold off to pay for imports. Trade imbalances deepened. What could not be sold was pledged. What could not be pledged was promised. The empire's future earnings were, in effect, spent in advance. Recovery was mortgaged to secure survival. Think about that. The public rarely sees the side of war. It is too abstract, too technical, too distant from heroism. Yet it is often decisive. Battles decide who survives the present. Finance decides who controls the future. Britain won the war. That much is true. But winning on the battlefield did not mean winning control over what came next. The younger power across the Atlantic understood this reality well. It did not need to dominate through occupation. It could shape outcomes through credit. Lending does not look like control. It looks like assistance. But assistance that cannot be refused creates imbalance. An imbalance, once established, rarely disappears on its own. The transformation was subtle. There was no announcement, no declaration that Britain had crossed a line. Instead, it showed up in quiet ways. Negotiations became more constrained. Economic policy grew cautious. Every major decision was weighed against external confidence. Would markets react? Would lenders approve? Would credit remain available? These questions began to matter as much as domestic needs. This was the moment when power began to shift without spectacle. The empire that once dictated terms now found itself responding to them. The change did not happen overnight, but its direction was clear. Britain had entered the post-war world not as a financial leader, but as a financial client. This story challenges a comforting narrative. It suggests that empires do not always fall for defeat or rebellion. Sometimes they are reshaped through obligation, through contracts signed under pressure, through debts accumulated in silence. This chapter asks a dangerous question. How did the world's largest empire become dependent on loans from a younger power? And what happens when the balance of power shifts not through conquest, but through credit? The answer would reshape the global order. It would redefine leadership, influence, and sovereignty. And it would do so quietly, without parades or decorations. Because debt does not announce its victories. It simply waits, accumulates, and collects. Before the cracks appeared, the illusion of strength was convincing. Britain looked formidable, even after years of total war. Its navy still ruled key sea lanes, guarding trade routes that had defined global commerce for generations. Its empire remained vast, stretching across continents, linking ports, plantations, mines, and markets into a single imperial system. The pound still circulated widely, accepted in places far from London. To the outside world, Britain looked bruised but unbroken, a great power that had endured its hardest test and lived to tell the story. London, despite the scars of bombing, remained a financial capital in appearance and tradition. Its institutions were old, experienced, and respected. Banks that had financed railways in Asia and ports in Africa were still standing. Civil servants spoke the language of stability. On paper, the empire still functioned. The machinery of power had not collapsed. It had merely slowed. And that distinction mattered, because it allowed leaders and citizens alike to believe that recovery was simply a matter of time. War spent was framed as temporary. Extraordinary measures, the public was told, would fade once peace returned. Loans were described as partnerships between allies, not as dependencies. Emergency agreements were sold as short-term necessities, not long-term constraints. Factories roared with production, often around the clock. Dockyards stayed busy. Ships crossed the Atlantic in endless convoys, carrying supplies in one direction and obligations in the other. To the public, this looked like resilience. To policymakers, it looked manageable. After all, Britain had survived wars before. It had borrowed before. Debt was not new. In earlier conflicts, Britain had raised funds, absorbed costs, and emerged stronger. History seemed to support confidence. The empire had always found a way to turn sacrifice into advantage. Why would this war be different? Why would this borrowing lead anywhere other than another recovery? But beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. The scale of this war was unlike anything Britain had faced. It was not a conflict that could be financed through incremental taxation or limited borrowing. It was total war, consuming entire economies. Reserves that once seemed deep were exhausted rapidly. Gold flowed out faster than it could be replaced. Overseas investments, built over decades, were sold to cover immediate needs. Trade, once Britain's lifeblood, was disrupted, redirected, or suspended entirely. The empire was no longer financing itself. It was being financed. And that distinction altered everything. The source of that financing mattered as much as its size. The United States was not just another lender. It was an industrial giant operating at full capacity, with factories untouched by bombing and infrastructure intact. While Britain repaired damage, America expanded. While Britain rationed, America accumulated surplus. While Britain borrowed, America lent. This imbalance was structural, not temporary, and it gave the lender patience. Loans do not exist in isolation. Each one deepens the relationship. Each agreement sets expectations. Every extension of credit carries assumptions about influence. At first, the terms appeared generous. There was urgency, after all. Britain was fighting for survival. Conditions were softened, language was diplomatic, and reassurance was constant. But generosity in finance is rarely permanent. It exists only as long as leverage is growing. Imagine a nation that once set the rules of global trade, now negotiating from necessity. Imagine leaders accustomed to dictating terms now asking for extensions, approvals, and understanding. That shift was subtle, but it was real. Negotiations that once would have been straightforward now carried tension. Britain needed continued access to resources. And access always comes with expectations. The illusion of strength persisted because symbols remained intact. Flags still flew. The empire was still administered. Colonial governments still answered to London. Yet the financial foundation beneath those symbols was thinning. Control over currency was constrained. Policy options narrowed. Decisions increasingly had to align with external confidence rather than internal ambition. To the public, none of this was obvious. People saw ships returning, factories still running, and officials speaking with confidence. The language of victory dominated headlines. There was little appetite to examine balance sheets after years of sacrifice. Questions about debt were deferred. Recovery was assumed. Optimism filled the space where caution should have lived. But optimism does not erase arithmetic. Britain's obligations were accumulating quietly. Repayment was postponed, not canceled. The longer the illusion held, the deeper the dependence grew. Borrowed resources kept the system functioning, but they also delayed confrontation with reality. That delay was costly. This was the calm before the financial turning point, a moment when everything appeared stable. Yet momentum was already shifting. Britain was still powerful, but its power was increasingly reactive rather than directive. It responded to circumstances rather than shaping them. The empire moved, but it did not steer. Strength built on borrowed resources carries a hidden fragility. As long as credit flows, stability holds. The moment conditions change, the structure is exposed. Britain had not yet reached that moment, but it was moving toward it steadily. The illusion of continuity masked a deeper transformation already underway. From the outside, the empire looked unchanged. From the inside, options were narrowing. The machinery of power still turned, but the fuel now came from elsewhere. And whoever controls the fuel ultimately influences the direction. Think about that. An empire that once financed the world was now dependent on the confidence of another. It did not collapse. It did not surrender. It adjusted, and in that adjustment, the seeds of transformation were planted. The stage was set for the moment when debt would stop being a tool of survival and start becoming a mechanism of control. The hidden mechanism was not dramatic, but it was relentless. Loans arrived quickly, often framed as lifelines, negotiated under urgency, and justified by necessity. Repayment, however, lived in the future, and that future came with conditions, not always written in bold, not always announced publicly, but present all the same. Britain did not just repay in money. It repaid in choices. Each obligation narrowed what could be done next. Each agreement shaped the space in which policy could move. Debt did not command. It constrained. At first, the pressure felt manageable. Repayment schedules were distant. Interest seemed affordable. Confidence rested on the belief that post-war recovery would restore balance. Britain would rebuild. Trade would resume. Growth would return. The debt, many believed, would shrink naturally as prosperity expanded. That assumption had worked before. But this time, the structure was different. Recovery itself required resources, and resources still had to be financed. Currency controls tightened as policymakers tried to defend stability. The pound protected not through strength, but through restriction. Capital movement was limited. Trade priorities were adjusted. Imports were scrutinized not just for necessity, but for cost and scarce foreign exchange. These were defensive moves, designed to buy time, but defense has a price. It slows flexibility. It reduces momentum. It signals vulnerability. To meet obligations, Britain began selling what it had once owned. Overseas assets, accumulated during decades of expansion, were liquidated to cover immediate needs. These were not symbolic losses. They were structural. Revenue streams disappeared. Influence faded. Once sold, assets rarely returned. Each sale solved a short-term problem while weakening long-term position. This was not mismanagement. It was arithmetic under pressure. Sterling weakened, not because of panic, but because of design. The system itself placed strain on the currency. Britain needed dollars to service obligations and pay for imports. Dollars had to be earned or borrowed. Earning them required exports in a world where competitors were stronger and factories elsewhere were newer. Borrowing them increased dependence. The cycle fed itself. This was a turning point. The empire that once exported capital now exported promises. Its credibility rested not on abundance, but on discipline. Recovery was no longer about growth alone. It was about reassurance. Markets had to be convinced. Creditors had to be satisfied. Stability became the primary objective, even when it conflicted with ambition. Colonial resources were squeezed harder, not to build a future, but to service the past. Raw materials flowed outward under pressure. Local economies were shaped to meet external needs. This was not expansion. It was extraction for repayment. The logic was unavoidable. Obligations had to be met somewhere, and the empire, still vast, was the easiest source. At the same time, across the Atlantic, a different story unfolded. American industry expanded without exhaustion. Factories modernized rather than repaired. Infrastructure grew instead of being rebuilt. While Britain allocated resources to stabilize, America allocated resources to advance. Productivity rose. Influence spread. Its currency strengthened, supported by surplus and confidence. The contrast was not about intent. It was about position. This was not collapse by explosion. There were no sudden defaults, no dramatic announcements, no visible crisis that demanded immediate attention. Instead, there was erosion, quiet, legal, documented in ledgers rather than headlines. Decisions accumulated, borrowed to stabilize, sell assets to repay, accept conditions to maintain access. Each step made sense in isolation. Together, they reshaped power. Policy became reactive. Instead of setting terms, Britain responded to them. Instead of exporting stability, it defended it. Instead of leading, it negotiated. This shift was subtle enough to escape popular attention, yet deep enough to alter outcomes. Power does not vanish all at once. It recedes gradually, disguised as prudence. Think about that. Power is not lost when flags fall. It is lost when alternatives disappear. When every option carries a cost that cannot be paid. When flexibility gives way to caution. The empire still existed. Its institutions still functioned. But it no longer moved freely. It adjusted constraints imposed by its own survival strategy. Each agreement reinforced the pattern. Credit flowed, but only under terms that prioritized repayment. Growth served creditors first. Domestic needs came second. Long-term planning bent around short-term stability. The future was managed, not designed. This is how debt asserts influence without issuing commands. The financial center of gravity crossed the Atlantic without ceremony. No treaty declared it. No conference announced it. It happened through balance sheets, reserve levels, and currency strength. Confidence migrated. Capital followed. Leadership shifted from those who needed funds to those who supplied them. Britain remained a significant power, but significance is not control. Influence now required alignment. Autonomy demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice had already been spent during the war. The margin for independence had narrowed. This chapter is not about blame. It is about mechanism, about how survival choices compound over time, about how borrowing during crisis reshapes the post-crisis world. Britain's path was logical, even unavoidable. But logic does not protect against consequence. By the time the structure was visible, it was already embedded. Debt had become more than a burden. It had become a framework, one that determined priorities, limited options, and redirected power. The empire still stood, but it stood on terms it no longer fully controlled. And once that shift occurs, reversal is rare, because escaping debt requires strength, and strength under obligation is the hardest thing to rebuild. The aftermath did not arrive as a single moment of collapse. There were no fires in the streets, no sudden declarations of failure. Britain adjusted. That adjustment is what changed everything. Bases were closed quietly. Commitments were reviewed, then reduced. Promises made during an era of abundance were reassessed in an era of limits. The empire did not fall apart. It thinned, and thinning, over time, can be just as decisive as defeat. Maintaining global reach had always required money. Ships had to sail. Administrations had to be funded. Garrisons had to be supplied. In a world where credit now had conditions, every distant obligation carried a measurable cost. Decisions that once felt strategic now felt expensive. Leaders began asking not where Britain should be present, but where it could still afford to be. That change in mindset mattered. Power that must constantly justify its expense loses its freedom to act. Independence movements across the empire accelerated, and not only because of ideology or pressure. Cost played a central role. Holding territory required investment, and investment competed with repayment. Every pound spent abroad was a pound not used to stabilize at home. The debtor empire could no longer act like a creditor one. It could not finance expansion while servicing obligations. Choice replaced confidence. Withdrawal replaced assertion. This was not a story of retreat driven by weakness alone. It was a story of arithmetic. Debt demanded discipline. Discipline demanded restraint. Restraint reshaped ambition. The empire that once expanded by funding development now measured influence against balance sheets. It was not that Britain lacked will. It lacked margin. As commitments shrank, global leadership shifted. Influence moved toward those who financed growth rather than service debt. Power followed surplus. The post-war system reflected this new reality. Currency dominance, trade rules, and financial institutions increasingly reflected the priorities of lenders, not borrowers. Britain remained involved, respected, and capable, but it no longer set the tempo. It adapted to it. The transformation was quiet enough to be misunderstood. Many observers framed it as a natural evolution, a graceful transition from empire to nation. But grace can hide constraint. What looked like choice was often necessity. What looked like generosity was often limitation. The debtor empire learned to speak the language of realism, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. This matters because debt does not only affect the present, it shapes the future by narrowing what can be imagined. When resources are committed to servicing the past, the future must wait its turn. Innovation slows. Risk tolerance drops. Planning becomes conservative. Stability replaces vision. These are rational responses, but they carry a price. Britain's story after the war is not one of disappearance. It is one of repositioning under pressure. The nation remained influential. Its culture, institutions, and experience continued to matter, but command had shifted. Leadership now flowed through systems Britain did not fully control. Influence required cooperation rather than direction. The lesson here is not about betrayal or generosity. It is about structure. Debt rearranges power without firing a shot. It rewards patience, scale, and timing. It punishes urgency. It favors those who can wait over those who must act. During the war, Britain had to act. After the war, it had to wait. That difference defined a new order. Think about how this changes the meaning of victory. Winning the war secured survival. It did not secure sovereignty over the future. The bill arrived later, and it arrived with consequences. Britain did not lose its empire in a single decision. It managed it into a smaller shape because the alternative was instability. This story matters because it did not end in the 20th century. The mechanism remains the same. Modern nations still face the same choice under different conditions: borrow to survive or control the terms of survival, accept help or preserve autonomy. These are not moral questions. They are structural ones. Imagine a world where influence flows through interest rates instead of armies, where leverage is exercised through access rather than force, where power moves quietly, documented in agreements few people read. That world was not invented recently. It was refined here. Britain won the war. That is not in dispute. But the bill rewrote its future, not with drama, but with discipline, not with conquest, but with constraint. And that is why this story deserves attention, because it reveals how power actually moves when the noise fades. If you want more stories that explore how money, debt, and quiet decisions shape the world we inherit, subscribe to this channel. And if this story helped you see history differently, share it with someone who thinks empires only fall on battlefields.